It is just before 5:30 on the morning of December 28, 2014, and the runway at Juanda International Airport in Surabaya, on the eastern coast of Java, is still dark beneath the lights. On the apron, an Airbus A320 sits in the pre-dawn humidity, painted in the red livery of Indonesia AirAsia, waiting for its passengers. 155 of them are about to board for a routine 2-hour flight to Singapore Changi. Mostly Indonesian families, with some Singaporean nationals among them. 3 South Koreans, a Briton, a Malaysian, and 23 children. 7 crew are already on board. The captain, reviewing the flight plan, is Irianto, 53 years old, a former Indonesian Air Force fighter pilot with more than 20,000 flight hours behind him, over 4,600 of them on this aircraft type. Beside him sits his first officer, Remy Emmanuel Plezel, 46 years old, a French national who had moved to Indonesia 3 years earlier, with just over 2,200 hours on the same aircraft. 43 minutes from now, both men will be alive in the cockpit of an aircraft falling out of the sky, and one of them will be telling the other to pull down, while the other keeps pulling up. The flight number is AirAsia 8501. The destination is Singapore, and the cause of what is about to happen lies inside a sealed unit bolted to the rear of the aircraft, in a soldered joint the diameter of a grain of rice, which had been quietly cracking for more than a year, and had triggered 23 warnings to the cockpit of this same airframe over the previous 12 months. Most of them dismissed as nuisance faults and reset by a maintenance crew who had never been told to look at the soldering itself. The component is called the Rudder Travel Limiter Unit, and there are 2 of them on every aircraft of this family, mounted in the tail. Their job is to restrict the rudder's range of motion as the aircraft accelerates. At low speed, the rudder can swing freely, while at cruise speed, where any large rudder input would tear the tail off the aircraft, the limiter clamps the deflection to just a few degrees on either side. Both units are controlled electronically through the aircraft's 2 flight augmentation computers, small black boxes on the avionics shelf that handle, among other things, rudder limiting, yaw damping, and the input filtering that lets the autopilot fly the aircraft smoothly. On one of those electronic cards inside the rudder limiter of this particular aircraft, a single soldered joint carried a microscopic crack. A crack that had begun to form sometime in 2013, the result of the temperature differential every airliner experiences in normal operation. Sunlit ground at 35 degrees Celsius before takeoff, followed within 20 minutes by -55 degrees Celsius at cruise altitude. Solder, contracting and expanding through that swing on every flight, eventually fatigues and fractures. And once it fractures, the electrical continuity through the joint becomes intermittent, connecting at one moment and broken at the next. The aircraft would respond to a broken signal by triggering a fault warning to the cockpit. The crew or the maintenance team would reset the system. The continuity would return. Nobody would think to remove the unit and look inside. The fault first appeared on the aircraft in late 2013, and over the next 12 months, it appeared a further 22 times. In October 2014, the unit was reset twice. In November, 5 times. And in December, in the 4 weeks before the crash, the warning fired 9 times. Each time, a maintenance technician applied the same procedure. Reset the system, verify the warning had cleared, sign the aircraft back into service. And the maintenance log carried no instruction to disassemble the unit, because the manufacturer's troubleshooting tree did not direct anyone to disassemble it. As far as the airline's procedures were concerned, the fault was minor and repetitive, and minor and repetitive faults were managed by resetting them. 3 days before the accident, on December 25th, this same captain had been preparing this same aircraft for a flight from Surabaya to Kuala Lumpur. And during pushback, the rudder limiter warning fired again. The captain attempted the standard cockpit reset, pressing the push buttons on the overhead panel to power cycle the 2 flight control computers. But the reset did not clear the warning. The maintenance engineer on the ramp came forward and, working from a position behind the right seat in the cockpit, a position neither pilot can reach while strapped in, pulled the circuit breakers for both of those computers, waited, and reset them. The warning cleared, and the flight departed shortly after. The captain watched all of this happen, and as the engineer finished, he asked whether he could do the same thing himself if the warning came back. The engineer told him, accurately, that pilots may reset circuit breakers when an electronic checklist on the cockpit displays specifically tells them to do so. But the flight control computers are not on that checklist, and the engineer did not say this part. The captain heard what he wanted to hear, which was that he could pull the circuit breakers himself if he had to, and the conversation was not recorded. He did not raise it with anyone afterwards. The flight to Kuala Lumpur went uneventfully, and 3 days later he was back in the same cockpit, in the same aircraft, with the same fault waiting for him. The flight pushes back from Surabaya at 05:35 local time on the morning of the 28th, and the takeoff is normal. The aircraft climbs out over the Java Sea, turns north towards Singapore, and reaches its cruise altitude of 32,000 feet 14 minutes after departure. First Officer Plezel is the pilot flying. Captain Irianto is monitoring. The autopilot is engaged, and although there are towering thunderstorms in the area, common for the equatorial dawn, the aircraft is above most of them, and the radar shows clear paths between the cells. 25 minutes into the flight, the first chime sounds, a master caution accompanied by an amber warning on the central display, indicating a fault in the rudder limiter system. The captain reads the procedure on the screen. Reset Flight Control Computer 1. Reset Flight Control Computer 2. Presses the push buttons on the overhead panel, and the warning clears. The flight continues. 9 minutes later, the same warning sounds again, and the captain repeats the procedure. The warning clears again. 2 minutes after that, with thunderstorm cells now visible directly ahead on the weather radar, the crew turns 15 degrees to the left and contacts Jakarta Air Traffic Control to request a climb from 32,000 feet to 38,000, hoping to clear the weather. The controller asks them to stand by. There are other aircraft in their cruise band that need to be deconflicted first. And while they wait, the warning fires for a third time. And the captain resets again. And the warning clears again. A pattern has emerged. The fault is appearing roughly every 9 minutes, and each reset is buying them a little less time than the one before. The fourth warning fires moments later, and this time the captain does not reach for the push buttons on the overhead panel. He unstraps from his seat, stands, moves to the panel of circuit breakers behind the right-hand seat, the panel he had watched the engineer working at 3 days earlier, and pulls the circuit breakers for both flight control computers, then reseats them. What follows next happens faster than either pilot is prepared to register. On the ground, with the engines unstarted and the aircraft static, pulling and resetting those circuit breakers cycles the system cleanly. But in flight, with the autopilot engaged and the aircraft trimmed for cruise, pulling the same circuit breakers does something else entirely. It removes electrical power from both flight control computers simultaneously. The autopilot, which depends on those computers for its inputs, disengages without warning. The autothrust disengages with it, and the fly-by-wire system, deprived of the protections those computers normally provide, downgrades from its highest mode, known as normal law, to a degraded mode called alternate law, in which the aircraft no longer protects itself from stall, overspeed, or extreme attitude. The rudder, no longer being controlled or limited, returns to whatever last position it had been holding, which, on this aircraft, at that moment, was deflected 2 degrees to the left. The aircraft begins to roll left, and for 9 seconds, neither pilot moves the controls. First Officer Plaisel is the pilot flying, but his hands are not on the side stick when the autopilot drops out, and the cockpit is suddenly full of warnings. Chimes, alarms, master cautions, alternate law, autopilot off, dual computer fault. The captain is still standing behind the right seat, his hands occupied with the circuit breakers he has just pulled. By the time Plaisel takes the side stick, the aircraft has rolled 54 degrees to the left, well beyond any cruise attitude he has ever experienced. What he does next is the response of a pilot who has not been trained to recover an airliner from an unusual attitude at high altitude. He pulls back on the side stick, hard, and the aircraft, no longer in normal law, has no flight envelope protections to override him. Its nose pitches up and it begins to climb. At 32,000 feet in the thin air, an Airbus this size does not have much performance margin. The wings are producing barely enough lift to keep it level, and a sudden, steep climb under those conditions will bleed off airspeed almost instantly. Plaisel keeps the stick back. The aircraft climbs at 6,000 feet per minute, 3 to 6 times the rate of a normal climb, and reaches 38,500 feet within 30 seconds, the roll angle increasing past 90 degrees, then past 104 degrees at its peak, which is to say, the aircraft is no longer right side up. The stall warning begins to sound. Captain Irianto, by now back in the left seat, sees what is happening on the displays and tells Plaisel to push the nose down. "Pull down," he says in English on the cockpit voice recorder, using the phrasing that an Asia-Pacific pilot, whose first language is not English, uses to mean push the controls forward. Plaisel does not push forward. He continues to pull back. He may not have understood. He may have understood and disagreed. He may simply, like the first officer of Air France 447 over the Atlantic 5.5 years earlier, have been frozen in the instinctive response of a pilot who believes the way out of a bad situation is to climb away from it. The 2 side sticks on this aircraft are not mechanically linked, and when the captain takes his own side stick and pushes forward, his input is registered by the flight control system, but so is the first officer's continued input pulling backward, and the 2 cancel each other out. The aircraft hangs there at the top of its climb, stalled, neither nose down nor nose up, neither rolling nor recovering. And then it begins to fall. A stalled airliner does not nosedive, it pancakes. The wings stop producing lift, the airframe loses its aerodynamic shape in the airflow, and the aircraft descends nose up at terminal velocity, falling vertically through the air at speeds that look impossibly slow on the airspeed indicator and impossibly fast on the vertical speed display. The angle of attack, the angle between the wing and the oncoming air, exceeds 40 degrees, well beyond the value at which the system can recognize it as valid, and the stall warning, by this point, has gone silent. For the same reason it went silent on Air France 447 over the Atlantic. The readings are too extreme for the computers to accept, and so they reject them and stop sounding the alarm. The aircraft is falling at over 12,000 feet per minute. The two pilots are still working their side sticks in opposition, and the cabin behind them, in the dark of the early morning storm, is silent and almost certainly aware of nothing more than heavy turbulence. At 06:18 local time, 3 minutes and 20 seconds after Captain Irianto pulled the circuit breakers, the aircraft strikes the surface of the Java Sea. It is intact at impact, nose up, falling vertically, and the deceleration is instantaneous. The fuselage breaks apart on contact with the water, and all 162 people on board are killed. The wreckage came to rest in shallow water, only 32 meters deep, on a sandy bottom in the Karimata Strait, between Borneo and the eastern coast of Sumatra. The first surface debris was sighted by Indonesian Navy aircraft on the morning of December 30th, 2 days after the crash, and by early January, sonar had located the main fuselage. Bodies were brought up by divers in groups of 2 and 3 over the following weeks, slowed by rough seas and poor visibility, but never stopped. The flight data recorder was recovered on January 12th, the cockpit voice recorder the day after, and the main fuselage section, containing the bodies that had remained inside it, was lifted to the surface on the last day of February. In total, 56 bodies were recovered from the sea, but the remaining 106 were never found, carried away from the impact site by the Strait's currents during the 7 weeks between the crash and the recovery of the fuselage. Their families received empty caskets, or no caskets at all. The Indonesian National Transportation Safety Committee released its final report on December 1st, 2015, 11 months after the crash. The report ran to 220 pages, and its conclusions were not theoretical. Examination of the rudder limiter unit recovered from the wreckage showed a clear, fully fractured solder joint on the electronic card, the same crack that had been generating intermittent warnings for over a year. The flight data recorder confirmed that the captain had pulled the circuit breakers in flight. It confirmed the 9-second delay before any control input was made after the autopilot disengaged. It confirmed the climb at 6,000 feet per minute. It confirmed the dual side stick inputs in opposition during the descent. And it confirmed that the aircraft had entered a deep stall from which the crew, given their training and their experience and the few seconds available to them, had no realistic chance of recovering. The committee was careful not to assign blame, describing instead a chain in which every link mattered and no single link on its own would have brought the aircraft down. A solder joint that had been allowed to fail for over a year. A maintenance procedure that did not require anyone to look at the joint itself. A captain who had watched a ground engineer perform a circuit breaker reset and had inferred, incorrectly, that the same action was available to him in flight. A first officer whose training had not prepared him to recover from an unusual attitude at high altitude. And a cockpit in which two pilots, in the seconds that mattered, gave the aircraft contradictory instructions and were unable to communicate their way out of the contradiction in time. The committee's recommendations were sent to Airbus, to the airline, to the Indonesian Directorate General of Civil Aviation, to the United States Federal Aviation Administration, and to the European Aviation Safety Agency. Airbus was asked to revise its maintenance documentation so that recurring rudder limiter faults would trigger a hardware inspection rather than another reset. And pilots across the industry were directed to undergo compulsory upset recovery training, in which crews would practice, in simulators, the very sequence of events that had killed the people of this flight. The unexpected autopilot disconnect, the roll into an unusual attitude, the recovery requiring a nose-down input under conditions in which every instinct says nose up. AirAsia itself implemented 51 safety actions in the months that followed, most of them concerned with crew resource management and the call-out procedures that govern what one pilot says to the other when something goes wrong. Captain Irianto and First Officer Plazel were buried by their families in the early months of 2015. The captain's body identified through DNA analysis of remains recovered from the fuselage. The first officer's body never found at all. The aircraft, 10 years and 11 months old at the time of its loss, was written off in the accident database, and the flight number was retired by the airline within 72 hours of the crash, replaced on the Surabaya-Singapore route by a new designator that erased the old one from any future schedule. It is a story whose shape is, in the end, familiar. An airframe of the same family as Air France 447, an ocean nearly as deep as the Atlantic in places, and a cockpit in which, when the automation surrendered control to the human beings did not have the training, the time, or the shared understanding to fly the aircraft back from where the automation had left them. The difference, in this case, was that the disaster had been advertised 23 times in the year before it happened, and the advertising had been ignored every time, because nobody had been told to listen.